This photographer spent over 70 years creating photos, had a career that intersected with some of the most highly regarded photographers to ever produce work, and brought a level of irony and humor to the street genre, all while photographing some of the most well-known celebrities and political figures of the last 100 years. This is Street Smarts Volume 19, Elliott Erwitt. Erwitt was born in Paris and moved to the US from France in 1939. His interest in photography grew throughout his teenage years living in Hollywood and the environment that went along with it. Later, he would take photography classes at Los Angeles City College until he relocated to New York in 1948. There, he exchanged janitorial work for film classes at the New School for Social Research. He would go on to develop further as a photographer through different chapters of his life. Trips to France and Italy during his military service stationed in Germany, working freelance and having photos appear in Look, Life, and Holiday magazine. In the 1950s, he joined Magnum, where he served as the president for 3 years. In the 1970s, he turned his attention to creating documentaries, before a stint in the 1980s working at HBO on the creation of nearly 20 comedy films. Throughout all of these years, he shot portraits of incredibly famous celebrities and well-known politicians, had a lifelong infatuation with traveling and taking photos of dogs, and seemed to constantly cross paths with fate in terms of meeting the right people to help propel his photography forward and shape him into the renowned photographer he would become. Fate most heavily struck Erwitt early on, when he had a chance encounter with a photographer who would influence him firsthand, and has influenced so many of us through his work. That photographer was Robert Frank. However, unlike many street photographers, Erwitt was not influenced by his book, The Americans, but by the man himself through a trip to France on a ship both men simply happened to be on. The ship could only accommodate a small number of travelers, and at the time, this trip would have taken 7 to 10 days. So Frank and Erwitt had plenty of time to get to know each other. Frank photographed the journey throughout, and at some point, he asked Erwitt to take his photo, which began a lifelong friendship. Prior to his trip to Europe with Frank, Erwitt had shot exclusively with a Rolleiflex that produced square images. But Frank would often swap cameras with Erwitt, allowing him to experience a 35mm rangefinder for the first time. This camera produced rectangular formatted images and allowed Erwitt to experiment with different kinds of compositions. It also changed how Erwitt shot in other ways. He claims to have been shy in his younger years, and the Rolleiflex allowed him to compose his shots at waist level, looking down through the ground glass and avoid having to interact with or be noticed by the subjects of his frames. The rangefinder forced him to press his eye up to the camera, compose shots while facing his subjects, and break down the barrier of shyness he had built up to that point in his life. The trip motivated Erwitt to stay in New York long-term after he returned to America in 1950. He eventually shared an apartment with Robert Frank. During this period, Erwitt created his first photo book, which showed what he could do with a camera, and played some part in progressing his photography career to the next level. His photography would go even further once he became friends with Robert Capa and Roy Stryker, who he had met during his time photographing around New York City. Robert Capa, one of the founding members of Magnum, would later extend an invitation to Erwitt to join the photography collective, and Stryker would introduce him to Roy Stryker, the man who would help push Erwitt's work further through 2 more projects. The first was assigned to Erwitt as soon as they met, after Stryker handed him a $100 bill out of his pocket, which is the equivalent to $1,300 today. For this project, he asked him to photograph an oil refinery in New Jersey. After he saw what Erwitt produced, he extended an invitation to work on a project in Pittsburgh shortly thereafter. The goal of this project was to put on display Pittsburgh's attempt to move from the industrial city that it had been to the modern metropolis that it wanted to be. The work of photographers during this period in Pittsburgh's history was needed to help drive the narrative that the city's development was worth the financial and social cost the public would endure for the sake of said development. This work was commissioned by Roy Stryker. Stryker held significance in this type of project because he had previously crafted the documentary photography projects that took place during the Great Depression that had been seen as a great success and were funded by the United States government. The importance of this project, in light of Erwitt's progress as a photographer, is that Stryker was partly responsible for advancing the careers of photographers like Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, and Gordon Parks, among others. Stryker had become known for creating scripts for the types of activities and emotions he wanted photographers to capture while going about their work. But unlike other photographers from this and previous projects, Stryker allowed Erwitt the opportunity to photograph whatever he wanted. Although Stryker had clearly had confidence in Erwitt's abilities, Many of his photos remain in a kill file that meant they were intended to be destroyed. Countless photos that did not meet Stryker's standards from projects created throughout his career were met with a hole punch that rendered them useless. Luckily, Erwitt's photos did not meet the same fate and reappeared much later. In total, all the photographers that worked in Pittsburgh created 18,000 negatives in the 3 years that this project took place. Erwitt only took part in this project for 4 months during that time span because he was drafted into the Army. Many of these photos had not seen the light of day until recently, when they appeared in a book called Pittsburgh 1950, which was created in 2017 and now holds significance in Pittsburgh as a time capsule for the city and evidence of the continued growth of Erwitt's abilities as a photographer, as he was able to capture the spirit of the people living there in a way few others could replicate. Erwitt's time in the Army would take his photography career even further. He feared that he would be stationed in Korea and meant to fight in the escalating conflict taking place there, but ended up being posted in Europe, which he attributes to 3 factors: his ability to speak 3 European languages, luck, and his friendship with Edward Stryker. Stryker was the director of the photography department at New York City's Museum of Modern Art, and a former Navy captain. He is responsible for helping foster the careers of a number of legendary photographers, and was aware of Erwitt's concerns about being drafted to Korea. Knowing this, Stryker contacted connections he had at the Pentagon, urging them to take advantage of Erwitt's photography skills elsewhere. He probably would have considered himself lucky enough to avoid conflict in Korea, but France offered him opportunities to take photos that would change his life forever. Since not much was going on where he was stationed, Erwitt took the opportunity to capture photos of soldiers watching the time go by. He entered these photos into a Life magazine contest, which he won. The award was $2,500, and having his photos published in Life's November 1951 issue, this helped elevate his photography career further because of the exposure that it gave him. Otherwise, throughout his stint in the Army, Erwitt mostly only took photos for IDs and some officer portraits. He used any time he had off to travel to Paris and take photos there. This is where he began to experiment with color. It's about reacting to what you see, hopefully without preconception. You find pictures anywhere. It's simply a matter of noticing things and organizing them. You just have to care about what's around you and have concern with humanity and the human comedy. Although some of Erwitt's projects are serious, he's just as well known for his less serious, often ironic and comical photography and outlook on life. One aspect that encapsulates this is the creation of Erwitt's alter ego named André S. Solador, which abbreviates to the word ass. Erwitt described him as a contemporary artist from one of the French colonies in the Caribbean, I forget which one, to satire the kooky excesses of contemporary photography, which includes smoking fish and self-portraits of André, who bears an odd similarity with Andy Kaufman's alter ego, Tony Clifton. Erwitt's less serious side is also seen in his affection for dogs and his commitment to making projects exclusively committed to man's best friend. These work include 1974's Son of Bitch, To the Dogs in 1992, Dog Dogs, Woof, and Elliott Erwitt's Dogs from 2008. You try to go to places where things do happen. When I walk my dog, I often take my camera along. Dogs are a good subject because they are very similar to humans. For me, they are people with more hair, and they don't ask for prints. The idea to create books that centered around man's best friend came to Elliott as he was going through old photos, noticed how many of them were pictures of dogs, and decided making a book with these photos was worth the try, because dogs are of universal interest. The comedic outlook on life is also found in Erwitt's project titled Museum Watching. I am a dedicated people watcher who loves to see art and art watchers watching. For a photographer, rather than fly casting, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. This project observes the observers and works as an analysis of the odd association the general public has with visiting museums and taking in art in a variety of ways. Few being extremely serious about taking in deep and considered looks at the art they're observing, and others taking fleeting glances at each photo before moving on to the next. Over the years of taking in others taking in art, Erwitt has come to the conclusion that the majority of human interaction with art comes from our desire to always be somewhere. Erwitt is also known for a number of famous photos of celebrities and politicians. These included photos of Grace Kelly, Marilyn Monroe, Jack Kerouac, JFK, Jackie Kennedy, Che Guevara, and Fidel Castro. Probably the most historically significant event that he photographed was the kitchen debate, which took place while he was working for Westinghouse Refrigerators in Moscow. The photos from this event show Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev debating the merits of capitalism and communism while looking at Western-style demo kitchens. Erwitt is most well known for his black and white photography, but has also shot a large amount of color. He relied on natural light, and most often focused on taking photos in a way that allowed him to capture candid moments. He used significant cropping to produce some of his most iconic frames, and clearly believes in finding and portraying emotion within his photos to display something we can easily connect with, even if it can't always be easily categorized, or easily explained in terms of how these photos are made. When photography is good, it's pretty interesting, and when it's very good, it is irrational and even magical. Nothing to do with the photographer's conscious will or desire. When the photograph happens, it comes easily, as a gift that should not be questioned or analyzed. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to help push this in the algorithm. And until next time, keep developing.